Okay, good morning. How you doing, guys? We are going to start our training for spiritual first aid, responding to our time. I've got my care and recovery team here, and we're going to go through this training with you. Um, we are excited about the potential for so many people to be poised, equipped to respond to people as they move into crisis. And you may be thinking, well, what's the crisis? What does it look like? How do we know when people are moving into a crisis mode for themselves when we talk to them? So if you're doing this training, you're on the front line, and you are someone, whether you're a group leader, a pastor of the day, someone involved with our response to the weekend messages, our guest services, our community care team, and you are potentially going to be talking to people depending on their where they are in their life, who are going to be in some level of crisis because the circumstances we find ourselves in are overwhelming. The scope of it is unheard of, and so we need to be prepared. And so this is a way for us to gain some tools that are intuitive and that I think are very actionable to help us engage people if they move into crisis. But let's back up a little bit, guys, and talk about some orientation. Um, so back in March, it seems like so long ago, I know, of March 19th, our community began a journey of endurance together. March 19th is the date that the statewide lockdown went into effect. And so what we really did was start a journey of endurance. And so those of us, everyone started that journey with different levels of um, different abilities to adapt and be resilient over time. And that's really what it's going to take for us to finish this well. But there are some things that come against our ability to adapt and our resiliency, and that's access to resources and spiritual and emotional support. So what happens is everybody has different levels of resources as they started this journey, and different networks of spiritual and emotional support at different levels. And so the farther we get, the more we draw down on those two things. And therefore, as we draw down, that will affect our ability to adapt over time and our ability to come back from the normal ups and downs of life that don't stop. So we don't stop having jobs. For many of us, some of us don't stop losing. I mean, there are all these life events like losing a job, having a job, putting kids through school, taking care of family members that don't stop. And so that comes on top of our circumstances, which is we're all in this endurance journey, and it's drawing down everybody. So crisis, when we go into crisis mode, it's because we're running dangerously low on resources and dangerously low on spiritual and emotional support. And so that's where we're going to meet people to help bolster them in those two things so that they can continue to adapt and be more resilient as we take the next step. But here's the thing, we can learn some things from what we call mass trauma events. Now, there's not a ton of research on epidemics and surviving them psychologically, believe it or not. There is some, but it's limited, and certainly not here from the United States in the last 100 years. So we're looking at drawing on learnings from natural disasters, mass shootings, tragic public events, to understand how to respond and what modalities and tools we can employ to help people get through this situation. So what we're experiencing now, while it doesn't have the shock value of a natural disaster like a hurricane or a flood or a fire, as we've seen in the last few years, it does have some of the same features as it wears on us over time, emotionally and psychologically and spiritually. And so what we really need to do is look more toward the uniqueness of these events. And that is, we have to look at this as something that can only be understood with time lapse. So here you've got a picture of LAX and planes taking off. And this is not something that you would see at LAX, a whole flock of planes. or fleet, this is a time-lapse photo. And so this is about an hour and a half of planes taking off, one at a time at LAX. But when you time-lapse it, you realize just how much, how busy and how much traffic you can have in just 120 minutes. So as we think about the losses that we are accruing or began to accrue on March 19th, it's a plane taking off, another one, and another one. But they happen and they're spread out. They happen, they just come at us one at a time. But if we turn around and we take stock, we realize that, wow, we've lost a lot. And so we have to look at this type of mass trauma with time lapse and understand it, that though it happens slowly, the cumulative effect has to be acknowledged. Okay, so one more thing as we look at orientation. There's a difference between a shock trauma, like a hurricane, a flood, a fire, and trauma that develops over time, that accrues. So both shock and developmental have a definite date and time that precipitate a change, and losses begin to accrue. Both encompass every aspect of our daily life and threaten the full hierarchy of needs. So that's going back to Maslow's basic hierarchy of needs, belonging, food, shelter, those things that we must have to have any sense of well-being and to stay alive. So this is the nature of trauma, but the unique thing about where we are is these losses develop from one point, but develop over time with time lapse. The reality is, though, everyone has a wall. Right? Everyone has a limit. Everyone has a point at which they will have to push through, face the crisis of the moment, and find resource to get through. And that's where we come in. That's where our teams here that we're training are going to come in and help people who find themselves at their wall find another side to it. That's what we're training you for. Now, let's put this in context. So this training is spiritual first aid. Where does that fit in Mariner's overall understanding of how we're going to address care resources and employ them?